The wagon wheels groaned over the ruts of Ash Hollow's single street, their wooden spokes shivering under the weight of flour sacks, nails, and oilskins. The horse's breath steamed in the cold dusk, and Elias Boone sat tall and silent on the buckboard, his weather-beaten hat shadowing eyes that had seen too many winters. Beside him sat a woman the town had never seen, a veiled figure. Thin and straight-backed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. When she turned her face slightly toward the light, the thin white scar down her cheek caught. The last ember of sunset, like a quiet strike of lightning. Ash Hollow was the sort of town that didn't take kindly to mysteries. On the boardwalk outside, the saloon men paused mid-spit, their eyes narrowing. The blacksmith, sweat-streaked and hammer in hand, muttered something to the livery boy that made him grin. Behind the windows of the general store, faces gathered like moths. Elias Boone, who had buried his wife 5 years ago, and had since been married only to solitude, was bringing home another woman and one that no one knew. Laughter followed the wagon's slow crawl, rough and bitter as gravel. Elias kept his gaze forward, the reins slack but steady in his hands. He did not introduce her. He did not explain. He simply drove past the glances, the saloon chuckles, and the hard stares of men who thought they knew what kind of man he was. Mara had spoken her name only once, softly when he'd helped her onto the wagon that morning, did not flinch or meet their eyes. She was a ghost among the living, wrapped in a shawl the color of worn ash, her face unreadable, but for the scar that told of some cruelty neither of them dared name. The prairie waited for them beyond town, a stretch of wind-battered hills fading into gray. The sun dropped low, and the air carried the sharp tang of snow not far off. Elias said nothing for the long ride, though once he caught Mara staring at the horizon, as if testing whether the world might end, just past the line of sight. Her silence was heavy, but not unfriendly. It was the kind of silence that comes from having already said everything that matters in a life, only to be left unheard. By the time they reached the ranch, darkness had settled like an old coat across the land. The house sat on the rise, weathered planks silvered by seasons, the barn sagging slightly at the ridge. A lantern burned in the window where he'd left it, but the wind rattled the shutters like restless bones. Elias climbed down first, boots, striking the frozen ground, and offered a hand to her. She hesitated just for a breath before placing her hand in his. It was cold, frail, but steady. Inside, the house smelled of cedar smoke and the faint sweetness of coffee gone cold. He lit the lamp on the table, the warm glow chasing shadows across walls marked with years of living alone. A single rocking chair stood by the hearth, a faded quilt draped over it. On the mantel, untouched, was the small wooden carving his first wife had once cherished, a dove with wings outspread. Mara's eyes lingered on it for a moment, but she said nothing. Supper was quiet, the clink of forks and the low sigh of the fire their only voices. Elias watched her hands as she ate, delicate hands that trembled only once when the wind howled through the eaves. He wanted to ask who had left her with that scar, why she had agreed to come here, and if the silence she carried would one day swallow them both whole. But words felt like stones too heavy to lift. When the plates were cleared, she stood by the firelight, her face a study of shadows and tired grace. Elias knew then, without knowing why, that whatever had broken her was not unlike what had broken him. Neither of them was whole. But perhaps on this lonely stretch of earth, there was room for two broken things to rest. The wind cried against the windows as he banked the fire for the night, and in the hush of the small house they both listened to the fragile, unspoken promise that had begun to stir thin as smoke, but alive. The days settled into a rhythm as cold and brittle as the frost that crept across the windows each morning. Mara moved through the house like a wisp of smoke. Silent and self-contained, her footsteps soft on the worn pine floorboards. She chose the smaller bedroom at the far end of the hall, the door always closed. At night, Elias heard her moving once when he'd woken in the dead of night. He'd caught the faint sound of her whispering something, a prayer or a memory, into the dark. He did not pry. He had learned long ago that some wounds are only deepened by questions. She avoided his gaze during meals, her eyes on the table or the fire. He noticed the way her hands trembled when she carried wood inside, the way her shawl clung to her shoulders as though she feared the air itself might bite. Sometimes he wanted to tell her she was safe here, that whatever ghosts followed her could not cross this threshold, but the words never found shape in his mouth. Safety, he thought, was not something that could be promised, not anymore. Ow! Morning, just as the first light bled across the hills, Elias found her sitting on the porch. She was braiding her hair in long, careful strands, her fingers moving with the quiet grace of someone who had learned patience the hard way. The pale scar on her cheek caught the soft gold of dawn, and for a moment she looked almost like a painting, fragile, timeless, and unbearably distant. Something in him shifted then, a strange stirring that was not desire but recognition. She had been through fire and come out burned, but not broken. He knew that feeling well. And the ranch held its silences like a church. The wind swept across the prairie with the sound of whispered names, rattling the barn doors and sighing through the fence posts. Elias spent his days in the barn, mending tools older than his own hands, running fingers over the iron handles, and splintered wood as if touch could coax the years back. An old plow leaned against the wall, rust flaking from its blade. He remembered sharpening it with his late wife standing nearby, her laughter bright as sunlight on water. He hadn't heard laughter like that in years. Upstairs, in a cedar trunk at the foot of his bed, lay the wedding dress his wife had worn on that spring day so long ago. He'd never been able to part with it. The fabric had yellowed around the edges, but when he touched it, the ghost of her still felt close the way her hands once rested on his shoulders, the smell of lavender soap clinging to her hair. He closed the trunk gently, as if afraid the memories might scatter like dust. Mara hummed in the kitchen when she thought he was too far to hear. The tunes were low and mournful, foreign in rhythm, but strangely soothing. Once, leaning against the barn door, Elias listened to her song drifting through the open window. It was a sound that filled the empty spaces of the house without asking for permission. He wondered if the melody carried the language of her past, words she no longer dared to speak. He wondered who had hurt her, who had left her wandering alone in this world until she found herself here under his roof. The first snow came sudden, blanketing the fields in a hush that felt both merciful and suffocating. The land became an endless stretch of white, the sky heavy with gray. The ranch seemed smaller then, as though the weight of winter pressed it inward. Mara stayed near the hearth, her shadow curling against the wall as she tended the fire. Sometimes Elias would pass by, their eyes meeting for a moment before she looked away, and he'd feel something tighten in his chest, a reminder that survival was not the same as living. At night, when the cold wind slipped through the cracks and the rocking chair creaked under his weight, Elias found himself thinking of second chances. He had not asked for another life, another woman, or another shot at warmth, and yet in the quiet between them he felt the faintest pulse of something alive. Perhaps trust was not built with words, but with the slow passing of days. With the sound of her song in the next room, and the sight of her braiding her hair in the dawn light, perhaps, he thought, they were both waiting to see if the other would stay. The storm rolled in at dusk, a black curtain sweeping across the plains, bringing with it a wild chorus of wind and rain that hammered the roof like a drum. Elias had just stoked the fire when a sharp knock came at the door, urgent, uneven. He opened it to find a young man half collapsed against the frame, rainwater streaming from his dark hair, blood streaking his arm. His clothing marked him as Lakota, and his breath came in shallow bursts, lips trembling from the cold. For a long moment Elias hesitated. Old memories rose, stories of raids, of anger and mistrust that had smoldered between settlers and tribes, like an unending fire. But the young man's eyes held no threat, only exhaustion and pain. Before Elias could speak, Mara appeared at his shoulder. She stepped forward without a word, her shawl slipping as she bent to help the stranger inside. Elias saw something soften in her face, a tenderness he had not seen until now. as though her own pain had found recognition in his. Mara knelt by the hearth, her hands deft as she unwrapped the blood-soaked cloth around the boy's arm. She cleaned the wound with warm water, her movements careful, almost reverent, and when he flinched, she murmured a low tune one Elias had heard before, a song she hummed when she thought no one was listening. The firelight painted her face with gold and shadow, and Elias, sitting back in his rocking chair, felt something stir in him like a slow-burning ember. Love, he realized, was not loud or demanding. It was this quiet, patient, unafraid of suffering. The storm outside raged through the night. Wind clawed at the shutters and howled down the chimney like voices crying from another time. Elias watched Mara tending the stranger, her dark braid falling over her shoulder as she worked. He wondered what it was in her that compelled such care when she herself seemed so hollow, so locked away. Perhaps, he thought, it was a kind of healing that came only from helping another survive. When the young man could finally speak, he gave his name as Chaska. He spoke in halting English, telling of trouble beyond the hill's stolen livestock, settlers blaming his people, whispers of revenge. He had been caught in a scuffle while trying to warn his kin of an ambush. Elias listened, his jaw tight. The boy's story carried the weight of a world that was always on the edge of tearing itself apart. Elias knew the town would not take kindly to him harboring a Lakota boy, especially with tempers flaring and fear running high. Yet when he looked at Chaska and then at Mara, fingers brushing gently against the boy's wrist to check his fever, he knew his choice. The ranch was a lonely place, but it was still a place of shelter. Whatever the cost, he would not turn the boy away. Long into the night, Elias sat in his chair, the fire throwing restless shadows on the walls. Mara's song lingered in the air, soft as breath. He thought of the laughter he'd heard in town when he brought her home, of the way people believed he had lost his sense. Yet here, in this storm-lashed house, felt something truer than pride or fear. The slow unfurling of trust of a life quietly beginning again. Word spread faster than wildfire on dry grass. By the week's end, Ash Hollow knew Elias Boone was harboring trouble. Lakota boy under his roof was enough to reignite every old wound and whisper of fear the settlers had carried since the borderlands first bled. Men at the saloon muttered about stolen cattle and scalped hunters, each tale taller than the last, until Elias's ranch became a symbol of betrayal. And then there was Mara, ready a shadow in their gossip. Now, she was called worse. A stranger who'd bewitched a grieving man, a woman with secrets as dark as the scar that marred her face. The pressure pressed in from all sides, a weight that seeped into the quiet corners of Elias's home. He caught himself watching the horizon more often, a rifle leaning by the door. At night, when Mara's footsteps passed in the hall, he wanted to tell her to stay inside, to keep close, but the words felt too heavy on his tongue. He feared for her, but he didn't know how to speak that fear without it sounding like doubt. She noticed. One evening, while Chaska slept, she set the coffee pot down on the table with more force than needed. "Why do you keep me here?" she asked, her voice low, but edged with something raw. "The town looks at you like a fool. You could have left me behind." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as if the flames might answer for him. "Because I know what it is to be left behind," he said quietly. It was the first time he had given her anything close to a truth. The fire crackled between them, throwing red and gold light across her face. Mara's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Then, as though the dam had cracked, she spoke in fragments. A family slaughtered by raiders, a home set aflame, the scar carved on her cheek by a man who wanted her broken, not dead. Her voice was steady, but the air around her felt carved from grief. Elias said nothing, not because he did not care, but because the weight of her story deserved silence more than hollow comfort. His jaw tightened, and his hands curled around the mug of coffee until his knuckles whitened. Later, when the silence had settled back between them, he poured her a fresh cup. Their hands brushed hers, small, cool, and calloused, and neither pulled away. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft and soundless, cloaking the land in a pale hush. For the first time since she had come to his home, Mara held his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now, only the quiet recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be remade by suffering. Something thawed in that moment, as subtle as the shift of a fire's flame. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something strong enough to keep them both sitting there long after the coffee grew cold. Listening to the snow settle against the windows and the crackle of the fire that burned steady between them. The trouble came after sundown, when the prairie had gone dark except for the silver wash of moonlight. Elias heard the riders before he saw them, the dull thud of hooves against hard ground, the metallic rattle of spurs. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and waited. For men appeared out of the shadows, their faces stern, their voices thick with liquor and anger. The leader, a broad-shouldered man from town named Cutter, called out without dismounting. "We know you've got him here," Cutter said, his words like gravel. "That boy's kin burned Mickenness's barn last spring. We'll not stand for it. Hand him over." Elias stood still, his grip steady on the rifle. "He's no threat," he replied, his voice quiet but solid as the land beneath their feet. "You'll not take him while he's hurt and under my roof." One of the men spat, muttering something about traitors and fools. Cutter's gaze shifted, narrowing. "You'd risk everything for a stray savage and that woman no one knows? Folks are saying she's cursed you." Elias felt the words like a slap, but before he could speak, Mara stepped out of the doorway. The shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders trembled in the wind, but her voice did not. "You speak of curses," she said, her tone low but clear. "But the only curse I see is men too blind to remember that kindness is not weakness." Voice seemed to still the air for a heartbeat. The men shifted uneasily, caught off guard by her calm. "But anger is a fire that feeds on its own smoke." One of them raised his rifle and a shot cracked the night. The bullet missed, but the chaos it sparked did not. Sparks from a lantern, knocked over in the scuffle, caught on dry hay in the barn. Within moments, flames licked the night sky, orange and wild. Elias moved fast, firing a warning shot that sent the men retreating, while Mara dashed to the barn. "Pulling at the doors, Chaska," she shouted. The boy stumbled out, coughing, his eyes wide with fear. Together, Elias and Mara dragged the horses free, their faces streaked with smoke and ash. The fire roared until there was nothing left to burn. By the time it died, the barn was a blackened skeleton against the moonlit prairie. Elias stood with his hands on his knees, breath ragged, watching Mara as she pressed a damp cloth to Chaska's forehead. Her hair was undone, her braid unraveled by the night's fury. Something clenched inside him. He had almost lost her, this strange, scarred woman who had become without his noticing. The pulse of his home. Later, inside the house, the fire in the hearth glowed low and soft, casting amber light across the room. Mara sat near him, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders, her hands still trembling from the night's ordeal. "I've never belonged anywhere," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Not since my family, since everything burned. But here, tonight, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore." Elias didn't speak. Words felt too fragile, too shallow for what lived between them now. Instead, he reached out, his calloused hand resting over hers. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was enough. The silence that followed was not empty, but full like thee. Quiet after a storm, when the earth exhales and the stars return. The dawn after the fire came pale and cold, the prairie wrapped in a thin shawl of frost. Elias stood by the fence line, his breath visible in the crisp air. The charred remains of the barn still smoldering faintly behind him. When the sound of hooves broke the stillness, he turned to see the sheriff riding up, his coat collar turned against the wind. The man dismounted slowly, his hand brushing the brim of his hat, eyes taking in the wreckage. "Folks are saying there was trouble." "Out here," the sheriff said. "You all right?" Elias nodded. There was no need for a story. The fire, the anger, the choices made, it all hung in the silence between them. The sheriff's gaze drifted to the doorway where Mara stood, shawl drawn close, a steady presence. In the morning light, her scar was visible now, but it no longer looked like something meant to shame her. It was simply part of her face, part of her truth. The sheriff's jaw softened. "If there's trouble brewing in town, I'll see it." "Settled," he said quietly, before turning his eyes to Chaska. The boy was ready to leave, his arm bandaged, his belongings tied in a small bundle. He met Elias's eyes and gave a nod, silent, solemn, but filled with gratitude. It felt like a blessing, a bridge built wordlessly between two worlds that rarely saw each other as human. Elias watched as Chaska rode away, the horizon swallowing him like mist. That Sunday, Elias and Mara rode into town side by side. The saloon grew quiet when they passed. Men who had laughed when Elias brought her home now avoided his gaze, or met it with something new respect perhaps, or the shame of having misjudged what they could never understand. At the church steps, Mara stood beside Elias, her chin lifted. Her presence was no longer questioned, was undeniable. In the stillness of that gathering, Elias realized that neither of them owed the town their stories. Dignity wasn't something given, it was claimed. Held close like a flame shielded from the wind. That evening, as snow began to fall, the ranch felt different, less a place of solitude, more a home made by two survivors who had chosen to share. The quiet. Elias brought out two rocking chairs, placing them side by side on the porch. They sat in silence, watching the snow lay a white quilt over the scarred earth. Mara's braid was loose, a dark ribbon against her shoulder. She glanced at him, the firelight from the house behind them reflecting in her eyes, and something passed between them without words, a warmth that spoke of a love too deep for easy naming. Elias reached for her hand, and she let him hold it. There were no promises spoken, no need for them. The sound of the rocking chairs creaking softly, the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney, the slow fall of snow on the prairie, this was enough. World beyond might still judge, but here in the quiet glow of firelight and winter's hush, they had found something unbreakable.